Constantinople, the 1650s. Night, the Greek quarter near the shores of the Golden Horn. The smell of smoke from oil lamps mixes with the aroma of rose water and cloves. Narrow streets are still wet from the day's rain. In the house of the sweet merchant Bekir Effendi, craftsmen are working. They pour onto a marble table previously dusted with starch, a hot, barely setting mass, something between honey and a cloud, between air and jelly. Hands move quickly, confidently. This is not a cake, not a candy, not a marshmallow. This is something entirely different, completely new. They cut the mass with a sharp knife into cubes. Each cube is tossed in a mixture of starch and powdered sugar, and there, it is done. In a few hours, this product will enter legend, will be banned under one ruler, saved and cherished under another, will become a symbol of the empire and outlive the empire itself. But right now, it is simply an idea that does not yet have a name, has no history, has no destiny. It is simply Turkish delight, and nobody knows what is being born right now. Here is a thing that nobody says about Turkish delight. It was a revolution not so much culinary as social. Yes, historians will say that it is simply a sweet, a pleasant treat typical for Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean, but they are deeply mistaken. Turkish delight was that through which an entire civilization passed in order to speak of feelings when words became dangerous. It was food that made possible what politics forbade. The legend tells it like this, and every senior family member tells it to their younger one before bed. In the 17th century in Constantinople, a famine occurred, not the usual lack of provisions, but a true famine, the kind that changes cities. People starved each other for a loaf of bread. Grain prices soared so high that common folk lived exclusively on bread and water, allowing themselves nothing more. Vegetables, meat, fruit, everything was either inaccessible or forbidden for commoners by decrees issued by pashas. In this gloom, in this hungry darkness, Bekir Effendi, a man from a simple family, according to one source the son of a muezzin from the new mosque, according to another the grandson of a spice merchant who arrived from Anatolia, decided to create a sweet that would be cheap, filling, and most importantly, comforting at the same time, to give people not so much nourishment as hope, comfort in the form of a sweet cloud that melts on the tongue and reminds, if only for 1 minute, of better times, of luxury, of the fact that beauty exists in the world. But there is truth in this legend, and that is why I believe it, although academic historians throw up their hands. Bekir Effendi used ingredients that were accessible to literally everyone, even the poorest family. Starch from corn or wheat, a product produced everywhere. Honey or saccharin obtained from local sources, from sugarcane that grows on the eastern shores. Rose water, which was born as a waste product of perfume production. There was plenty of it, it was thrown away. Cloves, cinnamon, cardamom, spices that had already lost value because the market was flooded. He added starch there, a delicate, barely discernible element upon the first taste, which created the texture, that very tender, airy structure that distinguished his creation from everything that existed on earth before it. No eggs, no butter, which cost more than silver, no expensive milk or cream, only the geometry of starch, only the chemistry of heating and cooling, only the understanding of how starch molecules work at high temperature in the presence of sugar. Historians say, this is a legend, this is mythology, this is a beautiful story that has no documentary confirmation. But the fact is that in the documents of the Constantinople court dating to the 1660s, a mention of a legal dispute between two sweet merchants appears for the first time. Both demand the right to sell a certain new sweet that they call lokum. One of them claims that he is the first to start preparing it. The court never decided who was right, but the fact is that the sweet already exists. The address of one of the shops, Barzi Chesmi Street, Emendin District, a house with a number that in those days was recorded not in digits, but in words. By 1680 there were already about 5 shops in the city where lokum was specifically prepared, and in each its own family secret, its own recipe, its own pride. By 1700, more than 20. By 1730, it is already impossible to count. It became a profession. It became an art. It became a tradition. And here the legend comes into force again, and here reality becomes beautiful. They say that Bekir Effendi one day came to Sultan Mahmud. He was a ruler who loved comfort, and rarely left the palace. Bekir Effendi requested an audience, which was an incredibly bold act for a merchant. Perhaps someone among the courtiers recommended him. Perhaps he was simply persistent. Perhaps history here exaggerates. He brought with him a silver platter on which lay cubes of lokum, pink as a sunset, tender as a cloud, sweet as a whole lifetime of happiness. The Sultan tasted it, and then occurred that which changes histories. He ordered it to be made the sweet of the palace, the official sweet of His Majesty. This is not just a compliment, this is an appointment to a position. This is the placement of your product in the center of power, in the heart of the empire, in the chambers where the ruler of the faithful himself lives. The documentary truth here is more modest than the legend. In the archives of the Topkapi Palace, there indeed are records stating that in the 18th century lokum was prepared in the royal kitchen. This is a fact that I can confirm. In the procurement registries of food materials of the 18th century, huge quantities of starch are mentioned that arrived specifically for the preparation of palace sweets. Factually, this is a fact. When and why they began to prepare lokum there, in which exact year, this already becomes a narrative. This is a story about what history would like to remember, what history chooses for its memory. But what happened next? This is already entirely real. This is recorded. This is visible in letters and documents. When lokum entered the palace, it ceased to be just food. It became a currency of diplomatic exchange, became the language spoken by kings. Diplomats brought it as gifts to European monarchs, packaged in luxurious boxes, wrapped in silk. The French King Louis XV received a box of lokum in 1730. This is recorded in the report of the French ambassador in Constantinople. Diplomat Pierre de Jouarden wrote about this in a letter to royal advisors. The Spanish court also received one, the princes of the Holy Roman Empire too. The Austrian court sent a return embassy demanding more. This was soft, sweet propaganda. This was a way to say to European kings, we are so refined, we are so rich that even our sweets are clouds. We have a miracle of the food world. And what do you have? By the middle of the 18th century, lokum became known across all of Europe, in Italy, in France, in England. Venetian, Greek, French, English merchants carried it by contraband, in secret compartments of ships as if it were gold or precious stones. Because in terms of price, for common folk it was more valuable than gold. One portion of lokum weighing 100 grams cost as much as a worker earned in a day, working from dawn to dusk. This was a product of luxury, a product of unattainability, and that is why it attracted people so much. And right here, at the most unexpected moment, when it seemed that Turkish delight had already conquered the world forever, the authorities attempted to stop it, to stop the spread, to stop the democratization of luxury. In the 1770s, when the Ottoman Empire began to rapidly lose territory, when it became absolutely clear that greatness was slipping away, that the sun had begun to set on the empire, the hierarchy rushed to protect the last symbols of its power. One of the viziers, a man named Kara Mustafa Pasha, issued a decree that was quite clear. Turkish delight is a luxury accessible only to the palace and the highest aristocracy. For everyone else, it is forbidden. No selling in bazaars and shops, no private preparation in homes, no attempts to imitate the sweet of the palace. This was not merely a culinary prohibition. This was an attempt to forbid the Ottoman Empire itself from sharing a sign of its greatness with the common people. This was an attempt to say, luxury remains luxury only if it cannot be obtained. If everyone eats Turkish delight, then Turkish delight ceases to be a symbol of power. The ban lasted precisely as long as the authorities needed it. Because the system that had once opened Turkish delight to the palace could not close it back up, it was already too late. The shops on the streets of Constantinople, on the streets of Istanbul, in the bazaars, in the alleys continued to prepare it in secret, at night, when the guards could not spot the smoke from the windows. Mothers taught their daughters the recipe, not a written one, of course, because a written recipe could be confiscated and burned, but an oral one, handed down from hand to hand, from kitchen to kitchen, from generation to generation. The recipe was simple enough that banning it physically was completely impossible. This was not alchemy, not a secret formula, known to only two living people. This was starch, honey, rose water, heat, and time. This was what could be found in any home. By the 1790s, the ban quietly vanished from the legal codes. Nobody repealed it officially. They simply stopped enforcing it. It simply disappeared, as if it had never existed. Because while the empire was bursting at the seams, losing military positions in the Balkans, in the Caucasus, in northern Africa, as Russian troops approached the capital, the people demanded at least this: the right to eat a cloud that smelled of rose and reminded them of better times, of greatness, of the fact that this had once been an empire. Bekir Effendi never became legendary in the sense of the European understanding. Painters did not paint him. His portrait does not hang in museums. His life is not described in a dozen thick books. But what he created outlived the Ottoman Empire itself. After the revolution of 1923, when Turkey renounced its imperial past, when the symbols of the old world were burned, Turkish delight remained. Not as a symbol of the empire. That was put to an end, but as a symbol of the city, as a keeper of memory. As that through which one can speak of a time that no longer exists. In 1844, 2 centuries after the birth of the legend, a shop named Bekir Effendi opened in Constantinople. A new name, but the very same business. It is located in the Emin district on Restem Pasha Square, a 2-minute walk from the place where, according to legend, it all began. Daily tens of thousands of tourists, pilgrims, people who know that if you were in Istanbul and did not buy Turkish delight in this shop, then you were not in Istanbul at all come here. They look at huge blocks of Turkish delight, pink, green, white, and colored stripes, with nuts with hazelnut oil, and buy boxes as gifts for themselves, for that memory they wish to carry away with them. This is one of the most visited sweet shops on the planet. Wikipedia writes about it. Tourist guides tell its story. Next to the shop stands a monument to Bekir Effendi, a sculpture erected in the 20th century. Although people are not entirely sure what he looked like. This detail is what I like most of all. The shop bears the name of a man whom nobody can prove ever existed. History remembers him, teaches him, erects a monument to him, tells of him as a hero, but the documents are silent. Archives do not know his name. This means that the man became larger than himself. Now to the mechanism, to the riddle, to that part of the story which is hidden in the molecules. This is why Turkish delight works precisely the way it works. Although nobody in the 17th century knew this, although Bekir Effendi and his students prepared it based only on intuition and experience and not on an understanding of chemistry. It is all about the starch, about its structure, about its ability to change. Starch is a long chain of glucose molecules, spirally wound, packed, inert. When you boil starch in water, when you subject it to the action of high temperature, these spirals begin to uncoil, swell, absorb moisture, become viscous, break into parts. The molecules diverge, break free, begin to catch water. They create a colloid, a state in which a solid substance is evenly distributed in a liquid, but at the same time does not dissolve completely. This is not a solution. This is not just water. This is something between water and gel, between a liquid and a web of molecules. When Bekir Effendi boiled starch in honey or sugar syrup, when he heated this mixture over the fire to a certain temperature, he created a colloidal system, viscous, stringy, heterogeneous. Then, when the mixture cooled slowly, very slowly, the starch molecules again wound back into spirals, but now in a new configuration, loose, porous, capable of trapping air. If during cooling the mixture is constantly stirred, air is trapped inside it. Air bubbles get stuck in the starch structure as if in a net. A foam is formed, which then hardens, a foam that remains solid even at room temperature, but remains sensitive to heat, to moisture, to time. This porous structure, this network of starch with air inside, this is why Turkish delight melts on the tongue, why it dissolves so quickly and so completely. When a piece of Turkish delight gets into the mouth, into the warmth, saliva immediately penetrates into the pores, into the microcracks, softens the structure. The starch molecules begin to separate from one another, relax, and it seems to you that the sweetness simply disappears, turning into nothing, into a memory. In reality, it becomes water, a liquid that dissolves in your body and heads to where it came from, into the blood, into the tissues, into energy. Rose water is not just a flavoring, not just an element that smells beautiful. It is an organic solvator, that is, a substance that helps other substances dissolve, which alters the ability of molecules to hold on to one another. When rose water is added to the mixture of starch and sugar, it not only imparts the scent, the characteristic aroma of roses, it physically alters the structure of the starch gel, making it even more delicate, even more airy, even more capable of absorbing moisture from the air and from saliva. This is not magic. This is organic chemistry. This is molecular physics. Honey, however, is not just a sweetener, not just a source of sugar. Honey contains fructose in large quantities, and fructose is much more hygroscopic than sucrose. That is, it attracts moisture from the air much more strongly, literally pulling moisture out of the surrounding environment. This means that Turkish delight prepared with honey will never be completely dry. It will always remain slightly moist, slightly soft, slightly tender even after weeks of storage, even if you keep it in a dry place. This is not a flaw in the recipe. This is a property. This is a feature. This is what makes honey-based Turkish delight better than sugar-based Turkish delight. Bekir Effendi did not know the word hygroscopicity. He had never heard of colloids or the structure of starch. He did not read scientific articles. There were none, but he knew how his kitchen worked. He knew that if you add rose water, the sweet becomes more delicate, that if you use honey instead of sugar, it stays soft for a long time, that if you stir the mixture during cooling, it becomes airy. This was an experimental method. This was a craftsman's intuition. This was experience passed from hand to hand. And this was enough. More than enough. This was enough for 300 years. Here is what strikes me most of all in the history of Turkish delight. Here is what makes this story a grand story. It is a story about how a simple idea outlives an empire, how a recipe becomes stronger than the law, how a cloud that you make out of nothing, out of ingredients accessible to everyone, can become proof that people stand by one another, protect one another, despite supreme power, despite prohibitions, despite crumbling states. A story that there are things that cannot be banned because they live in hands, in memory, in tradition. In our era, when information flows at the speed of light, when every recipe from the internet can be copied by a million hands in 1 second, when there is no place for secret and no protection for authorship, when everyone knows everything about everything. This story about the secret transmission of a recipe from generation to generation, from home to home, from mother to daughter sounds completely different. It sounds like a protest, like a quiet rebellion against every attempt to control what people eat, what they feel, what they are allowed to love, what they are allowed to remember. Turkish delight won not because it was delicious, although it was extraordinarily delicious. It won because people needed a symbol, something tender and accessible that reminded them of greatness in the darkest times, in the dark years when it seemed that greatness was gone forever. And when the state attempted to take this symbol away, when it attempted to monopolize even sweetness, people simply hid it, passed it along, over the shoulder, through time, through families, and saved it. Like a mother saves a child, like every generation saves what it loves from oblivion and from power. And this is the final meaning of the story, the essence that cannot be expressed otherwise, not in the starch molecules, although molecules are important, not in the chain of merchants, although the history of trade is important, not in the titles of sultans and viziers, although politics is important. The meaning is that there exists a substance that people are ready to defend silently, not by armed uprising, not by loud protests, but simply by cooking it at home, sharing the recipe, passing it further to their children, grandchildren, neighbors. There exists food that, by definition, is an act of resistance, an act of memory, an act of love. Because when you make Turkish delight, when you stand at the stove and stir starch into syrup, you say, I do not agree with the order. I do not agree that beauty should be only for the chosen ones. I am making it anyway, and I give it to my children so that they too remember that there are things that nobody can forbid. This was another dossier of the Culinary Archive. If you want the stories to continue, subscribe to the channel. Every week we open a new dossier. See you in the archive.